Ellisville, Mississippi, a small town where secrets were hard to keep. For over 30 years, Sheriff Harold Grayson had been a respected figure in the community. At 56, Harold was the kind of man who commanded respect not through force, but through his unwavering sense of duty. He had been a sheriff long enough to see it all: petty crimes, family feuds, and the complexities of rural life. But in all his years, nothing prepared him for the betrayal that was about to shake his life. Harold had married Clara 27 years ago. She was everything he wasn't: beautiful, social, and outgoing. Clara balanced Harold's reserved, often silent demeanor. Together, they had built a life full of routine: a house, 2 children, and a sense of stability that Harold thought would last forever. Clara worked as a senior accountant at Lindell Construction, one of the largest companies in the area, and over the years, her career had flourished. Harold had always admired her ambition. At first, her long hours seemed just a part of her success, but as the years went by, the distance between them began to grow. Clara had always been the life of the party, but soon, Harold noticed something subtle. She started to retreat into herself. The phone calls late at night, the weekend trips for work, and the long hours at the office became the norm. At first, Harold didn't mind. He understood the demands of her job. But soon, he began to feel something was wrong. Clara was no longer as engaged when they were together. The easy conversations they used to have grew strained, and their time together felt forced. Harold tried to ignore the growing tension, but it gnawed at him. One night, while Clara's phone sat unattended on the kitchen counter, Harold saw a name he didn't recognize: Trey Garrison. His stomach dropped. Trey was a colleague from Clara's office, but Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. The text was innocent enough. About work, no doubt, but something about it unsettled Harold. He had never felt jealous or suspicious of Clara before, but now, doubt crept into his mind. The next few days brought more signs: late nights, mysterious text messages, and a change in Clara's demeanor that Harold couldn't ignore. Her attention was divided, and when he asked her about it, Clara would brush him off. "You're imagining things," she'd say, dismissing his concerns with a smile. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. Something had shifted, and Harold was no longer sure of the woman he had married. It wasn't until the Grayson family reunion that Harold's suspicions reached their breaking point. It was supposed to be a simple celebration, a time to gather with friends and family, but this year felt different. Clara seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone, her gaze darting to Trey Garrison, who was unusually close to her. The way they interacted, the way she smiled at him, made something inside Harold snap. Stepping outside for a moment to clear his head, Harold felt the weight of what was happening. He had always trusted Clara. She had been his partner, his confidant, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. But now, with the evidence before him, he could no longer deny it. Clara had been having an affair. The thought hit him like a punch to the stomach, and he staggered back in shock. The life they had built, the love he had trusted, had all been a lie. Harold felt like a stranger in his own life. The distance between them had grown so wide that it seemed impossible to bridge. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, all of it crashed down on him at once, and as he stood in the darkness of the backyard, the truth set in. His world was about to shatter. The reckoning had begun. The night after the family reunion, the air in the Grayson household was thick with tension. Harold lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Clara was beside him, breathing softly in her sleep, oblivious to the storm raging in Harold's mind. He had never felt more alone. The woman he had trusted with everything, the mother of his children, the woman he had pledged his life to, had betrayed him. And yet, in the silence of the dark room, Harold couldn't bring himself to confront her. Not yet. The thought of it was unbearable. Clara had always been the center of his world. For years he had believed in their marriage, had placed his faith in her, thinking that they were untouchable. But now, it was all a lie. Clara had been seeing Trey Garrison, the younger man from her work, for nearly 3 years. The evidence was undeniable. The stolen glances, the secretive phone calls, the way she had smiled at him that night. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Clara had betrayed him. The following morning, Harold tried to go through his usual routine. But everything felt different. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. Clara was in the kitchen, making breakfast, as if nothing had changed. She smiled when she saw him walk in, but Harold could barely look her in the eye. How could he? How could he pretend everything was normal when their entire world was built on lies? "Good morning, Harold," Clara said cheerfully, flipping pancakes on the stove. "You're up early today." Harold grunted in response, his gaze fixed on the coffee pot as he tried to steady his breath. He didn't know how to talk to her anymore. He didn't know how to pretend he didn't know. The anger inside him was rising, but so was the pain. It was like his heart had been ripped out and stomped on. Every time he looked at Clara, all he could see was her betrayal. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her understand the depth of the hurt she had caused. But the words caught in his throat. Clara didn't seem to notice his distance, continuing with the mundane tasks of their morning routine. She went about it all like she always had, humming softly as she cooked, moving about the kitchen with a calmness that made Harold sick. How could she act like everything was fine? How could she stand there, preparing breakfast, when her secret had torn apart everything they had built? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Harold couldn't take it any longer. His voice, low and hoarse, broke the silence. "Clara." His hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles turning white as the words formed on his tongue. "I know about Trey." Clara froze, the spatula still in her hand, her face drained of color, and for a split second, Harold saw the panic in her eyes. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was enough. She slowly set the spatula down and turned to face him. "What do you mean?" Her voice was soft, but Harold could hear the edge in it, the thin veneer of calm slipping away.
"You don't have to pretend anymore," Harold said, his words sharp. I know about the affair. The late nights, the messages, the smiles. I know everything."
For a moment, Clara said nothing. She stood there, her eyes avoiding his, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence hung heavy between them, thicker than the air in the room. Harold wanted to scream, but he held it in. He had to hear the truth from her. He needed to hear it. Clara finally met his gaze, her expression one of resignation, and then the dam broke. She sighed deeply, a long, drawn-out breath that seemed to release all the tension from her body. "Harold, I didn't want you to find out this way. I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you?" Harold interrupted, his voice breaking. He had never raised his voice at her, never let his anger get the best of him, but now it was impossible to control. "Why, Clara, we've been together for over 20 years. Why would you do this to me?" Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Harold saw her as she truly was, vulnerable, regretful, and ashamed. She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. "I'm sorry, I never meant for it to get this far. It just happened. Trey and we've been seeing each other for almost 3 years. I never wanted you to find out, but I couldn't stop." Harold's breath caught in his throat. 3 years. 3 years. All this time he had been living with a lie, a betrayal so deep he couldn't comprehend it. Clara was still talking, but Harold couldn't hear her anymore. The words seemed to fade away, like a distant echo. All he could think about was how the woman he loved had been with another man for so long, and he had been too blind to see it. Clara moved toward him, reaching for his hand, but Harold pulled away. He couldn't touch her, not now. "Why, Clara? Why him?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why Trey? What was so wrong with us?" She stepped back, her face a mix of guilt and sorrow. "It wasn't about you, Harold. You're a good man, but I don't know, it just happened. Trey made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. I'm sorry, but I don't want to hear it," Harold cut her off. "I don't want excuses, Clara. You've broken everything, and for what? A fling? A few stolen moments?" Clara began to sob, her body shaking with each sob. "I didn't want to lose you. I didn't know how to fix it." Harold shook his head, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The trust, the love, the years of shared memories. All of it was gone. And, as Clara cried before him, all Harold could feel was the cold emptiness where his world used to be. The days after Harold discovered Clara's affair were a blur. The world seemed to have tilted off its axis, and everything he had once held dear was crumbling around him. He went through the motions, fulfilling his duties as sheriff, keeping his distance from Clara, but inside he was hollow. There was no peace in their home anymore. No laughter, no comfort, just silence, broken only by the occasional cold exchange of words. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to be lost in a state of guilt and shame, her attempts at reconciliation only pushing Harold further away. She tried to reach out to him, apologizing constantly, but every apology felt empty. How could she make up for what she had done? 3 years of lies, 3 years of betrayal. Nothing she said could erase the hurt inside him. Nothing could fix it. Every night, Harold lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with anger, confusion, and heartbreak. He thought about their life together. The vacations, the quiet evenings at home, their children growing up under their roof. Was it all a lie? Had Clara always been unhappy? Had he been blind to the cracks in their marriage? And Trey Garrison, what kind of man could betray him like that? What kind of man would take his wife from him? It wasn't just the affair that hurt Harold the most. It was the fact that it had been hidden for so long. Clara had lied to his face for years, kept this secret in the dark, while everything appeared normal on the surface. And the worst part was, he had trusted her. He had believed in their marriage, believed in their future. Now, that belief felt like a distant dream, something shattered and beyond repair. Clara tried to apologize over and over again, but Harold couldn't bring himself to listen anymore. Every time she spoke, it was as if her words were foreign to him. How could he forgive her? How could he ever look at her the same way again? One evening, as they sat in the living room, Clara spoke again, her voice trembling. "Harold, please, I know I've hurt you. I know I can never take back what I've done. But I need you to understand. I was lost. I don't know when it happened, but I lost myself, and I found someone who made me feel alive again. I never wanted to hurt you, I swear." Harold didn't answer right away. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkened street. He could hear Clara's voice behind him, but it felt so distant, like it was coming from another world. "How long, Clara?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "How long were you planning on keeping this from me? How long were you going to pretend everything was fine while you were sleeping with him?" Clara's face twisted with anguish. "I never planned for it to happen. I never wanted this. But it just did. I can't explain it." Harold turned around, facing her, his eyes filled with pain. "Do you love him, Clara?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Clara's eyes welled with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Finally she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I do." The weight of those words hit Harold like a freight train. He could hear Clara's sobs as she collapsed into the couch, her body racked with guilt. But he couldn't bring himself to move. He couldn't comfort her. He couldn't be the man who forgave this, not yet. "I don't know what to do anymore," Harold said, his voice empty. "I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know who I am." Clara reached out to him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. Don't touch me. I don't want your pity." The anger, the hurt, the confusion, they all came crashing down on Harold in that moment. He didn't know what to do with any of it. He was lost. His whole world had been turned upside down, and the woman he thought he knew, his wife, his partner, was a stranger to him now. The days after the confrontation were filled with more silence. Harold went through the motions, barely speaking to Clara. He felt numb, as if the world had become a place he no longer recognized. The weight of the betrayal was crushing, and yet there was an overwhelming sense of helplessness. What could he do? He couldn't forgive her, not yet. He couldn't forget what she had done, but the thought of his life without her, without the woman he had built everything with, was too much to bear. Clara continued to apologize, continued to beg for his forgiveness, but Harold remained distant, cold. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. He wasn't sure if he could ever look at her the same way again. How could he? How could he ever trust her again after everything that had happened? Weeks passed, and the tension in the house only grew. Clara's guilt consumed her. She spent her days trying to find a way to make things right, to fix what she had broken, but Harold couldn't find it in himself to forgive her. Every time he looked at her, all he saw was the lie. He saw the woman who had broken his heart and shattered the foundation of their family. And then one day Clara sat him down and said the words Harold had been dreading to hear, "I'm leaving." Harold looked at her, his heart sinking into his stomach. He didn't want her to leave, but part of him knew it was inevitable. How could they ever go back to what they once had? How could they rebuild something so broken? "I don't know how to fix this," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to make up for what I've done, but I can't keep living like this. I can't keep hurting you." Harold felt a strange mixture of relief and despair. He wanted her to stay, but he knew it was too late. The damage had been done and there was no going back. "I can't either," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The weeks after Clara's confession and her decision to leave were filled with an oppressive silence. The house, once a home filled with the sound of children's laughter and the bustle of family life, had become a mausoleum of memories. Harold went through the motions, but it was as if he were no longer truly living. He carried the weight of the betrayal in every step, each moment, each breath. The anger and hurt had become all-consuming. Clara's absence was palpable, but Harold was still haunted by the ghost of her betrayal. He had tried to push the pain aside to focus on his work, but every corner of their home reminded him of the life they had built together and the life that was now falling apart. He couldn't escape the memories, couldn't forget the quiet moments they shared, the love they once had. Clara had taken everything with her, his trust, his heart, and the future they had promised each other. For the first time in years, Harold wasn't sure who he was anymore. He had been the sheriff, the protector of his community, the father of 2 children, the husband of a woman he thought he knew better than anyone. But now, all of it felt like a lie. Every role he had played in his life had been built on the assumption that his wife was loyal, that she would stand beside him through thick and thin. And now that assumption had been shattered. It wasn't just Clara's affair with Trey Garrison that left him reeling, it was the betrayal. The way she had hidden the truth from him for so long, the way she had pretended everything was fine, while behind his back, her love had shifted to another man. For years, Harold had been in the dark, trusting a woman who had given her heart to someone else. The thought consumed him, and yet, as much as Harold tried to focus on his work, he couldn't ignore the inevitable truth. He had to confront Clara again. He couldn't move forward without closure. It was late one evening when Harold finally made the decision to confront Clara. He hadn't heard from her in weeks, and while part of him wished she would reach out, part of him knew that he had to take the first step. He needed answers. He needed to know why. Why Trey? Why hide it from him for so long? And most importantly, could they salvage any part of their marriage? Or was it truly over? Clara had been staying in a small apartment in town, a few blocks away from their old home. Harold hadn't been to visit her, hadn't wanted to, but tonight he found himself standing at her door, his hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure whether he was ready for what he might hear. He had thought about the conversation 1,000 times in his head, running through the possibilities, but nothing prepared him for what was to come. He knocked once, sharply. It was a sound he wasn't used to making. He had always been the steady one, the one who held things together, but now he was unsure. After a moment, the door creaked open. Clara stood before him, her eyes wide, but her face hardened with the same sorrow that had marked their last few conversations. "Harold," she said quietly, almost as if she hadn't expected him to come. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk," Harold said, his voice rough. "Can we sit?" Clara nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The apartment was modest, sparsely decorated. Harold could see that Clara had made it her own, trying to move on in her own way. But for Harold, it felt like another betrayal. A place where their life had been torn apart. He didn't know if he could ever look at it the same way again. They sat across from each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Clara, for the first time in weeks, didn't try to fill the silence with apologies. Harold felt her eyes on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. "What, Clara?" Harold finally asked, his voice cracking. "Why did you do this? Why him?" Clara's shoulders slumped, and her eyes dropped to the floor. She was quiet for a long time, as if searching for the right words. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Harold. It wasn't about you, I swear. It was about me. I was lost, and I didn't know how to find myself again. I didn't know how to talk to you. We were both drifting, and I didn't know how to fix it. Trey, he made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to stop myself from falling for him." Harold listened, but it all sounded like excuses. He had heard the same story 1,000 times before, the classic defense of a spouse who had cheated. But this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the lies, the deception. It was about the years Harold had spent trusting her, believing in their marriage, while Clara had built a separate life with someone else. "I love you, Clara," Harold said, his voice raw with emotion. "I would have done anything for you. And now everything's destroyed. I don't know if I can ever forgive you." "I don't expect you to," Clara whispered. Her eyes filled with tears as she finally looked up at him. "I don't deserve forgiveness, Harold. I don't know if we can fix this, if I can fix this, but I wanted to try. I didn't want to lose you." Harold stood up, walking over to the window, his back turned to her. He didn't want to see her crying. He didn't want to feel her guilt radiating in the air between them. The betrayal had cut too deep. He didn't know what to do with the pain, with the years of trust now shattered. Clara's voice came again, faint but pleading. "Please, Harold, tell me what to do." "I'm sorry." Harold closed his eyes. The truth was, there was nothing she could do. There was nothing either of them could do. The damage had been done. Their marriage, the life they had built together, was beyond repair. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "I don't know how to fix this. Maybe it's just over." The days that followed were like a blur. Harold and Clara both knew that there was no going back. The conversation they had shared was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Clara tried once more to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but Harold's heart had hardened. The years of trust, the shared history, they were gone, lost to the shadows of betrayal. Clara packed her things quietly, the house they had shared now hollow, empty. She didn't say much, and neither did Harold. The silence between them was more deafening than any argument they could have had. Clara kissed their children goodbye, her eyes filled with tears, and then she was gone. Harold sat alone in the living room, staring at the walls, the weight of his decisions heavy on his shoulders. His heart ached with the loss of his family, the life they had built together. But he knew deep down, that this was the only way forward. There was no place for the past in his future. The town of Ellisville went on, life continuing as it always had. People came and went, and the quiet rhythms of small-town life resumed. Harold returned to his duties as sheriff, but something had changed in him. He was no longer the man he had been before, no longer the man who trusted without question, the man who believed that love could conquer all. He learned to live with the emptiness, finding solace in the work, in the community that still relied on him, but the ache in his heart never fully went away. Clara's betrayal had left a scar, one that time could never heal. In the end, Harold understood something he hadn't before. Sometimes even love can't save you.